Welcome to Thursdays with Troy, everyone. As always, I'm Troy Lambert, mystery author, editor, super plotterer, and your host. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Jim Beach. Jim writes science fiction, fantasy, thrillers with dark humor. He's fascinated by science, politics, humor, history, and the bizarre and the metaphysical. He enjoys aiming questions at these subjects with arrows dipped in satire. Some of his works can be filed under Tales for Grown-Up Children. He's also a photographer, a recovering musician. Congratulations. I hope you have your coins. And his claim to fame, I think, besides writing, is that he once cleaned a house with 26 dogs in it. So welcome, Jim.
Glad to be here. Thanks. Looking forward to discussing this matter.
So first of all, to just get this out of the way for my own peace of mind, were all the dogs actually in the house while you were cleaning? I'm just trying to get a picture here of what that looked like.
Yeah, that was quite a life event. No, all the dogs had been removed from the house. They were all the same breed.
Oh, my.
So the owners were only letting 5 out in the yard at a time. So all the neighbors only thought they had 5 or 6 dogs.
Oh, my.
They had basically turned the upstairs of the house into a de facto kennel, and they were living in the basement. So it was pretty crazy. It was pretty crazy.
Oh, my goodness. Well, we're going to talk today not about dogs, as much as I'd like to talk about dogs the entire time, but about the rewriting process, specifically plotting your rewrite. And we all know, even architects like me, that the first draft is just getting the story down and telling it to ourselves. And so there's always changes between the first draft and the second draft and what happens as you write along. So we all go through some kind of rewriting process. Plottr can be a huge help in that area. So first, let's talk about what rewriting is. Define a rewrite for us through your eyes. What do you mean by a rewrite?
For sure. And it's a great question and a good distinction to make. Rewrite can mean a lot of things. To me, it tends to mean the more extensive reworking than just minor details, such as prose. Not minor when you get to the finished version, but prose can change a lot in the course of a novel. More substantive matters, such as overall theme, overall tone, world building that is developed, that is not consistent, that needs to be changed. Just different, plot points that end up not working out because in the first draft, I have gotten a better understanding of the character. I know that the character would not, in fact, react in this way or that way. They would actually do something else. These sort of issues that it's almost impossible to get from a first draft because you don't have a first draft yet to look back to. That's what I would consider rewriting.
Right. So obviously it's more on the developmental side of things. We're not talking about grammar and punctuation and things like that. We're talking about the actual story substance. So tell us, why is plotting your rewrite so important? So what are some of the benefits of plotting your rewrite rather than just sitting down and starting to rewrite?
Well, there are many. Probably the main aspect is just the ideas that can emerge in a first draft that I had not originally considered. Just lay there and wait to be developed. And if they're not to be developed, then it's more likely than not they should be weeded and saved for something else. So that requires a higher level overview and even a pause, I would say, in writing just to address it. Now, there's some methods of writing that can get around this, basically by doing the rewrite in the process of the writing, which is a good way to go and can be efficient and was used by a lot of pulp writers, where they would move forward, say, do 1,000 words, and then once they've written that, rewrite the last 500 words and move forward incrementally like that. But that doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work in all cases. And also, unless you've been writing a novel like that from the start, then that's not what you have in a first draft. You have a bunch of ideas that seemed fun that you don't want to just throw out. But then because you don't want to throw out, you have to go through them.
Right. Exactly. And that's actually a very good point. And because it's really important, I think, to distinguish rewriting. Now we're going to look at, we have a few different files we're going to look at. This is your initial file, Plottr file of this particular book. So tell us about, like, where do you start with an outline? Like, you're starting from scratch, you've just come up with an idea, and you're going to put your plot together. So I'm assuming that's what this file is this is just your initial outline and that group of ideas you talked about.
Yeah, I would say it's even, this is even a little after than that, because I'd been drafting this novel before I was aware Plottr existed. So I had already written a first draft and was just about to embark on the second draft. So this was just me mapping what I had written as the first draft already. Like what I was intending, what it actually ended up before I went back in. I've written other stories since then from Plottr from the beginning, but this is not that. This is the rewriting.
Right, and that's an excellent point in that when you say mapping what you already had, because I think that's a really important part to share with people. Is this is done from a draft. Right.
Yes.
So you already had an initial first draft. So you mapped what you already had.
Yeah.
So what did this enable you to do? Were you able to see like holes? Like I see in scene 3, there's a question mark there. Does that mean there was a question about what you were doing, or that you put there intentionally so you could rewrite that, or what was happening there?
That's me making a note, even in the process of mapping, that it seemed like something else should happen between scene 2 and scene 4.
Yeah, so when you're mapping out, and obviously you saw a hole, so you put a question mark there that says, hey, come back and look at this. And I think that's an important element of this whole thing too. So what are the next steps? Like, you're examining that first draft. Besides just spotting those holes, what are the ways that you use Plottr to just basically make that draft better?
Well, in this example in particular, you can see where I had added the timeline for Dan Harmon's story circle. So for people who may not be familiar with it, the story circle comes from writer Dan Harmon, who's behind shows such as Community and Rick and Morty. And I like to plot a fair amount based on at least some of the plot theories and strategies of television and movie, because they require strong plots and I like a strong structure. So Dan Harmon's story circle is basically breaking down the Campbell hero myth method into 8 steps. It's basically 3-act structure also, but it's done in 8 steps instead. And so all that to say, and this in the timeline, I'm putting the 8 steps, and then I'm mapping the scenes in accordance with where they go to that story structure. Where do they fit in?
Gotcha. So at this point, even once you've drafted, you're adding a template. Now, the template you add, for those who are listening, the template you add may be different than Dan Harmon's story circle. You may use the 3-story method. You may use whatever method that you like. But at this point, that's part of your process of finding holes, right? That's part of your process of finding, like, what am I missing? And how does this affect how you rewrite as far as the timing and the pacing of the book? Does this impact that as well? And how does that work for you?
Yes, this is impacting all of that, and probably most directly pacing, but also it's just affecting my understanding of the story that I've written so far and how it flows in cause and effect. So I have these 8 steps, which, as you said, are how I'm applying the story structure, but a 3-act story structure would work just as well. So this is me looking back on it and seeing for myself where different scenes are fitting in the act structure
right.
as part of this mapping stage. It's basically surveying the raw material that I've generated as a complete manuscript.
Right. So you're saying basically, are these in the right place? Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at your next iteration of this, which is basically, it's just the same thing, only in your next, basically your next go round at plotting this one. Yeah. And so let's take a look at that and tell us about the things that you added at this point. And, there's some obvious differences here.
Yeah.
So talk to us about what happened next and how this worked.
Sure. Well, you can see I wanted to keep track of for myself where I had added new text to the story and new chapters. And these, what is now chapters 2 through 5, are at least 2 and 3 are now what was the new scene that was mentioned in the previous timeline. This is the new text that seemed to fill in the transition between those story points that I could feel was missing.
Right. So where the question mark was, now we have chapter 2 and chapter 3. And
yes.
Answer that question mark.
Yes.
Beautiful. And I also noticed that you've changed from scenes to now you've got chapters across the top instead of scenes. Is that part of the evolution of just how you're tracking your story?
I was using scenes. Basically, I was using scenes or chapters as just buckets for text at this point, but things that are discrete. Right. So this is a complete beginning to end series of events with an ending that could be a scene or a chapter, depending on how you'd want to define that. But yeah, this is me using those buckets, keeping track of what I've moved around, so I can then, apply further revisions to this. This is me tracking what I need to add and then crossing it off as I've added it. And then leaving room for new things to be added now that I've done that. Basically, I'm fleshing out the story forwards along the timeline.
Right, exactly. And it's really interesting to see your evolution from your last iteration to this one. Yes. And then I see that you've also, so we've still got the story circle here, and you've added another timeline here at the bottom. Is that correct?
Yes, I started adding more timelines. You can see right above this, I'd added a timeline for phone conspiracy. That was an idea that I had come up with in the first draft that I really enjoyed. But I realized I wasn't paying it off. I just mentioned it and I didn't go much of anywhere with it. So this is me saying, okay, if this is interesting enough, I want to actually have an arc to this as a bit of a mystery. So I'm adding in, so that was one arc, but then there's other kinds of arcs too. And that's where you can see me starting to work with those as I scroll down. Like Ray is the main character. So in addition to the plots that happened to him, I wanted to plot a bit of his emotional arc, so you can have a good mix of external and internal effort, development. And I did that for him. And then I believe if you scroll down, you can see I started doing that for other characters also.
Yes. So that's excellent because you're also, as you're revising, you're adding more information that you've discovered on the way in your drafts. So basically, like how many drafts do you do of a book on average before you consider this to be your final draft?
It ends up being about 6 or 7 drafts. And the way that I define drafts is basically an end-to-end rewrite. Like there can be revisions within that, but it's basically when I've reached the end and I've put in most of what I was considering for that draft, so then I can take that and then look at the whole thing again. Complete iterations, I guess you could say.
Awesome. That is really cool. So what we're going to do on that note is we're going to take a look at your third iteration and kind of show people kind of the complete process, obviously, as we have it to this point.
Sure.
Now we'll look at the present day iteration, and you can walk us through that.
Sure. Right.
All right. So now we have this one pulled up. So I see now that scene 1 has become your backstory and your prologue. So I assume you've kind of added that, or was that initially there and it was just called something else?
That was not initially in the plot line. I wanted to add it because I had written a short story introduction for this novel. So in backstory, I just wanted to make sure moving forward that I was reminded of what had happened before the story starts. So that's me tracking that to be grounded on that. So I did that for the main plot. And I think if you scroll down, you can see I had done that for other arcs too.
Right, exactly. The Asha arc. I see you've added that there. And a couple other character arcs as well.
Yeah. Basically trying to track the story before the story.
Gotcha. Which that makes a lot of sense to keep track of those type of things. And you're right, we could talk about those reader magnets and that type of stuff in the marketing aspect all day long.
Sure.
But of course that'd be a different topic for a different day. But what it does show is that this enables you to have some continuity. So I'll ask you, if you were going to, as you move forward in this series, are you going to keep your series Bible in the same Plottr file, or are you going to create unique files for each iteration of them as you go along?
It would be most ideal just to have one Plottr file for it, one Bible, which I can then, also I could just export to Word or Scrivener if I'd like. But I definitely like the idea of single sourcing it and then being able to search back within one file and similar.
Excellent. So what other changes did you make to this kind of this iteration of this draft? And then kind of where are you with this one? Are you nearing the final draft of this one, or are you moving forward to other drafts with this book?
I'm nearing the final draft. I'm working with the last couple of chapters with a critique group. Then I will solidify all those changes, and I'll probably go to the beta reader stage and similar with that process. And this Plottr file in particular helped me get to that stage by helping me map out how ideas were bouncing across each other and then putting them in the sequence that they would need to happen logically per arc and per scene. And yeah, scrolling down, you can see I also added, I wanted to track what day it was because this happened over 3 days.
Oh, yes.
And sometimes, like I've written other things where I thought I had a good plot, and then I read through it and I realized that I had 30 hours worth of events that happened in one day.
Right, like an episode of 24, and
Yeah.
it just there was a lot happening there. No, that's those things are really good, and I think it's good for people to see that essentially you've created a different file each time you reiterated this, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You can create a different file within the same Plottr file, or however you want to do that type of thing. And I like how, as you've evolved along, you've just continued to add things. I mean, we can see the difference between Asha's arc here and the way it was last time is we've just got more information that you've learned through that second draft. So that's I think, is there anything else that you want to let people know about your rewriting process using Plottr? Like what, like a final takeaway for people that you want to tell them, this is something you should absolutely do.
This was useful for me in a lot of ways. I like within a scene arranging events within cause and effect from beginning to end. But I guess that's a personal preference. Probably the main thing to remember is remapping. It can seem like you know all the events because you wrote them, but when you can look at them from the outside in a series, then you can see how they bounce off each other. And then you can see how they lead to other ideas, which are very useful. And then you can arrange those ideas and sort them. Because one thing that I watch out for and that I've seen in other people's novels that they've been editing over time is that they can get so thick with ideas that aren't, and it's a natural consequence of working on a novel almost too long, because you continue to have cool ideas and you're like, wow, let me put that in there. But really it should be its own book. And it's just even further delaying the completion of this book. And I'll say also what this level of thinking, what this altitude of thinking of your manuscript can help bring is the identification of problems that stretch across several chapters that can require a lot of thought and then be solved with just a little writing.
Right, exactly. And I love those two terms, I think, are the two terms that we can take away from this real easily is, first of all, remapping, putting things back on a plot line and looking at them. Like, where does this fit? How does this work? And then the other one is altitude, because that's one of the problems we have as writers is we're too close to our work. And so we have to develop methods for getting further back to do those developmental edits. Otherwise, essentially, you have to pay a developmental editor to do it for you. And what they're really doing is showing you how to look at your work from a higher altitude that you can't see it from. So I think those are both excellent points in ways that Plottr can help you in your rewriting process. And those are two beautiful takeaways. So to wrap up, what other resources have helped you get where you are today? Obviously, you talked about the story circle and things like that, but what other resources, books, groups, things like that have helped you get to where you are now?
It's great. Great question. I will say I was also very much benefited in this current rewrite with Mark Dawson's editing class.
Yes.
Which had some great information on this sort of high-level view and how to apply it. I took a lot of benefit from quite a few things, but in particular for this draft, I took the idea of creating an emotional track for each chapter. So, these are the plot events that happened in this chapter. And also, what did the main character feel at the beginning of the chapter and then at the end of it? Which is something that can be easily lost track of. But when that's set down, it can just help propel through the entire story. So those, and also the idea of prioritizing changes. So basically assembling an edit list of changes and then ranking them by importance. So then, because one chapter might require 15 different changes to it, and they could all be small. But having the most important one first will then affect all the other changes that are made. So yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes that's one thing that you can take away from those too, is sometimes when you make those first changes, it actually fixes the other ones. If you prioritize them correctly, it actually fixes the other ones, and you cross 4 things off the list instead of 1. And Absolutely. So it's yet another way that getting that altitude can help you see what's happening in that thing. So that's fantastic. So tell people where they can stalk you. I noticed you actually used the word stalk on your website, so I was very proud of that. I was almost hopeful that I had some influence on that, because I always tell writers to tell people where they can stalk them and where they can find them. Just tell people where your website is, where they can find you, where you hang out the most, Facebook, Twitter, wherever.
Sure, great. I'm probably the easiest way to reach me is actually my Amazon profile page, which would be amazon.com/authors/James Beach. And there's also my website, which you were kind enough to mention, jamesmbeach.com. M as in Michael, BEACH as in the shore. And those are the 2 main places at this point. And I'm on Facebook too. I guess you'll see my Facebook link.
So, of course, every week we have a question of the day. And because I'm going to ask you an odd question,
Sure.
because, of course, I always ask odd questions, but I especially like to ask this one to sci-fi writers. So I want you to tell me, if you could live on one planet that was not Earth, anywhere, fictional or real, tell me what planet that would be.
I'll tell you what occurs to me. And this is another story I'd love to write someday. But what occurs to me is it would be great to be in some sort of steampunk sailboat in the upper gases of Jupiter, basically as a sea. And, the many different moons. And I think Jupiter even has rings. I should check on that. I think they're just sort of small. But in any case, something like that, I think I would thoroughly enjoy.
That's fantastic. And I should introduce you to a friend of mine who is a steampunk aficionado. The 2 of you would get along extremely well. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for your answer. We appreciate that. I think I could see myself sailing around Jupiter as well. That would be a really enjoyable time. At least you didn't say something like Alderaan and we'd have to send you to therapy. But anyway, thanks for joining us, everyone, on Thursdays with Troy. As usual, we hope you enjoyed yourself and learned a lot. I think this was a really informative session. If you've been looking at how Plottr can help you rewrite, this is just one method, but at least it allows you to see one of those methods of going back and looking at your draft. Remember, remapping and altitude. If you have questions that we didn't answer here and you're watching this later, you can always tag me in the Facebook group or tag James as well. And we're happy to answer questions for you, hopefully help you along the way of going through this process of rewriting through Plottr. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next week on Thursdays with Troy. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Troy. Great to talk to you.